Friends, gather round because we've got ourselves another trade tactic tragedy. It seems our old pal, the tariff man himself, is back at it again. This time he's set his sights on our neighbors to the north, Canada. You remember Canada, right? Those delightful folks who gave us hockey, maple syrup, and Ryan Reynolds? Yeah, well, apparently they're now public enemy number one, at least according to the latest round of tariff threats. Just this past week, the news broke that new tariffs on Canadian dairy and lumber are on the table. We're talking potentially massive tariffs, as high as 250% on dairy. Now, I'm no economics professor, but even I know that slapping a 250% tax on something is less of a trade tactic and more of a go directly to economic warfare. Do not pass go, do not collect $200 kind of move. The stated reason for this tariff tango? The tariff man claims Canada is playing dirty with its own tariffs on US goods, particularly dairy. He says they're ripping us off. But here's the thing about accusations. They tend to work better when backed up by, actual facts. So buckle up, buttercups, because we're about to dive headfirst into the messy, complicated world of international trade, where things are rarely as simple as they seem. And trust me, when it comes to tariffs, things are never simple. As you can imagine, Canada isn't exactly thrilled about being on the receiving end of these tariff threats. In fact, they've called the whole thing completely unjustified, and you know what? They might actually have a point. See, the Canadian government has been pretty consistent in its response to the tariff man's claims, basically saying, hold on a minute, that's not how this works, at all. They argue that their tariffs on dairy are perfectly within the bounds of international trade agreements, and wouldn't you know it, there are actual trade experts who seem to agree with them. Now, I'm not saying Canada is some kind of innocent bystander in all of this. Trade disputes are rarely that cut and dry, but it's important to remember that there are always two sides to every story. And in this case, it seems like the tariff man might be doing his best to rewrite the narrative in a way that benefits, well, him. Let's talk dairy, shall we? Specifically, let's talk about the Canadian tariffs on US dairy products that seem to be the source of the tariff man's ire. Here's the thing. Canada does have tariffs on some US dairy products, but it's not as simple as the tariff man makes it sound. For starters, those tariffs only kick in after a certain quota of tariff-free dairy has been reached. And guess what? The US has consistently remained below those quotas. So basically, the high tariffs that the tariff man is so worked up about, yeah, those aren't actually being paid right now. It's like getting mad at someone for charging you a $10 cover at a bar you've never even been to. Of course, the US dairy industry has its own set of grievances. They argue that Canada uses sneaky tactics to prevent the US from reaching those quota limits. And they might have a point. But even if that's true, is slapping massive tariffs on all Canadian dairy products really the best solution? Remember that trade agreement everyone was talking about a while back? The one with the acronym that sounds like a bad knockoff soda? Yeah, that's the USMCA, and it plays a pretty big role in this whole dairy debacle. See, the USMCA, which was actually signed by the tariff man himself, maintained those high Canadian tariffs on dairy imports exceeding the quota. So, the tariff man is essentially throwing a tantrum about a policy that he himself agreed to. It's like going to a restaurant, ordering the most expensive thing on the menu, and then complaining about the price when the bill comes. Look, I'm not saying the USMCA is perfect, no trade agreement is, but it's the agreement we have. And if the tariff man wants to renegotiate, well, that's a whole other can of worms. Dairy isn't the only thing on the tariff man's hit list. He's also got his sights set on Canadian lumber. Now I know what you're thinking. Lumber? Really? That's the hill he wants to die on? But apparently, it is. The tariff man's justification for targeting lumber is that the United States has enough of its own. And while that's technically true, it ignores the fact that the United States has relied on Canadian lumber for decades. In fact, about 30% of the softwood lumber used in the United States comes from Canada. And here's the kicker. Canadian lumber imports are already subject to duties. That's right, the United States is already taxing Canadian lumber. So, basically, the tariff man wants to punish Canada for a problem that doesn't really exist by doubling down on a policy that isn't actually working. Makes sense, right? Section 6. The price of protectionism. Now you might be wondering, John, why should I care about any of this? I don't eat that much cheese and I'm not planning on building a treehouse anytime soon, and that's a fair point. But here's the thing, These tariffs, if they go into effect, will likely impact all of us, whether we realize it or not. For starters, those dairy tariffs? Yeah, those could lead to higher milk prices. And not just a few cents here and there. We're talking potentially significant price hikes. And remember, milk is an ingredient in a lot of other food products. So, get ready for your cheese, yogurt, and ice cream to get more expensive too. As for the lumber tariffs, those could lead to higher prices for new homes, renovations, and furniture. And in case you haven't noticed, housing is already pretty darn expensive these days. Section 7, shaky ground for the economy. But the potential impact on consumer prices is just the tip of the iceberg. These tariffs could have much broader, more worrying implications for the US economy as a whole. For one thing, we're already dealing with rising inflation. Remember those empty store shelves we saw during the pandemic? Yeah, inflation is what happens when too much money chases too few goods. And slapping tariffs on Canadian imports is only going to make that problem worse. Then there's the issue of consumer confidence. When people are worried about the economy, they tend to spend less. And when people spend less, businesses suffer. And when businesses suffer, well, you can see where this is going. Section 8, North American neighbors, at odds. But perhaps the most concerning aspect of this whole tariff tiff is the potential damage it could do to the relationship between the US and Canada. These two countries aren't just neighbors, they're close allies and trading partners. Think about it. What do ketchup chips, Celine Dion, and the term AA all have in common? That's right, they're all beloved by Canadians and tolerated by Americans. That's how intertwined we are. Our economies are deeply integrated. We rely on each other for everything from cars to energy to, yes, even dairy and lumber. And disrupting that relationship, even in the name of protecting American jobs, is a risky move. Section 9. Trade tangles and future uncertainties. So, what does the future hold for this latest round of trade tensions? Honestly, it's hard to say. The tariff man is nothing if not unpredictable. But one thing's for sure, this whole situation is a mess. The tariffs, if they go into effect, will likely hurt consumers, businesses, and the overall economy. And for what? To score political points? To appease a few special interest groups? Look, I'm all for protecting American jobs and industries, but there are better ways to do it than starting trade wars with our closest allies. And in the end, we all might end up paying the price. But let's not forget the little guys caught in the crossfire, small dairy farmers in the United States. These aren't massive corporations with deep pockets. These are family-run operations, some of which have been in business for generations. Adding tariffs into the mix could spell disaster for many of these farms. Increased costs for equipment, feed, and other supplies mean tighter margins. And with retaliatory tariffs from other countries, their already thin profits could vanish altogether. For many, it's not just about business, it's about legacy, family heritage, and a way of life. The stress of potential financial ruin isn't just a number on a balance sheet, it's sleepless nights, strained family relationships, and dreams deferred. These are the real human costs of trade wars. While policymakers and economists debate the merits and demerits of tariffs, the small dairy farmers are left to navigate an increasingly uncertain future. In the grand chess game of international trade, it's often the smallest pieces that get sacrificed first. And for America's small dairy farmers, the stakes couldn't be higher. As trade tensions escalate, it's essential to consider the broader, long-term effects on the global economy. While the immediate impacts of tariffs and retaliatory measures are often clear, higher prices for consumers, disrupted supply chains, and strained international relations, the long-term consequences can be more insidious and far-reaching. Trade wars can lead to a decline in international cooperation, eroding the trust that underpins global trade agreements. As countries become more insular and protectionist, the collaborative spirit that drives innovation and economic growth may wane. This shift could result in slower global economic growth as nations focus more on protecting their own industries rather than competing on a level playing field. Moreover, prolonged trade tensions can stifle investment. Uncertainty over future trade policies makes businesses hesitant to commit to long-term projects, leading to reduced capital expenditures and slower job creation. This hesitation can have a cascading effect, affecting everything from technological advancements to infrastructure development. Emerging markets, which often rely heavily on exports to developed nations, could find themselves particularly vulnerable. Reduced access to international markets can stunt their economic progress, widening the gap between wealthy and developing nations. Lastly, consumers worldwide may face higher prices and reduced choices as companies pass on the costs of tariffs and adapt to new trade barriers. This can lead to decreased consumer spending, further dampening economic growth. In this complex and interconnected global economy, no country exists in isolation. The ripple effects of trade tensions can touch every corner of the globe, highlighting the need for thoughtful, cooperative approaches to international trade policy. While the immediate battles may capture headlines, the long-term war for economic stability and prosperity is a fight that requires unity and vision.